Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Little Rock, where love is our teaching and service is our prayer. I'm Nell Matthews, and I am one of your delegates to the Citizens First Congress. If you're a newcomer, I'm glad you joined us and you're here for worship today. And while you're here, please stop by the guest table out there and fill out a card. That way you'll get an email with information about what's going on in our church. And we get a little information about you. And after the service, we invite you to join us in the Meta Wing for the coffee hour. I now invite Sandy Schwartz to come forward to light our chalice and lead us in the affirmation of covenant, which you'll find printed in your order of service.
Okay, just the wrong way I turned the button. Okay. I light this chalice with these words. Open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Open our minds to know what is true. Open our hearts to love one another. Please join me in the affirmation of covenant. The words are in your order of service.
Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
The main thing that David Yaden and Andrew Newberg want to say in the variety of spiritual experiences is that brief, striking experiences, the kind that have been called spiritual, mystical, religious, transcendent, or peak experiences, are too common to be ignored, even though we often talk about them in ways that suggest they are extraordinary and rare. And the main thing Yaden and Newberg convey in their book is their own enthusiasm for exploring the challenges and opportunities of such experience that these present for psychiatry, psychology, and neuroscience. Let alone for science, the often profound impacts of spiritual experiences frequently raise challenges and opportunities for the people who have them. For example, in her recent autobiography, Building a Life Worth Living, Marcia Linehan, a clinical psychologist, reports having had what she calls an enlightenment experience while staying in a Catholic convent. She writes, "I went into the chapel, knelt at a pew, and gazed at the cross behind the altar. I don't recall what I was saying to God at the time, if anything, but as I gazed at the large crucifix, all of a sudden the whole of the chapel became suffused with a bright golden light shimmering all over, and I immediately, joyfully knew with complete certainty that God loved me, that I was not alone. God was within me. I was within God." I told very few people about my experience, partly because it was a private experience, but also because I didn't know how to describe it. I knew most people would not be able to understand it completely either. What I understood was that something transformative had happened. Now, that account stood out for me because early on in my training for the ministry, when I was serving in my first unit of clinical pastoral education, serving as a student chaplain at a hospital, I had a similar but subtly different experience. I had just made my first visit to a patient in the chaplain role, And beforehand, I'd been very anxious about that visit, and it went just fine. But afterward, I made a beeline for the chapel just to sit and breathe for a few minutes and reflect on it. Now, that chapel had a big figure of Jesus on the wall behind the altar, which I hadn't looked at very carefully, but just assumed it must be a crucifix. And that was part of why I hadn't looked at it very carefully. I sat down, I closed my eyes, and breathed for a minute or so, and then thought about that visit while looking down at my hands resting in my lap. And then I looked up toward the altar. It was not a crucifix up there. It was Jesus ascending into heaven, arms spread wide in a gesture of blessing. Look carefully, and you might find a blessing, is what I took from that experience. It wasn't a golden light and presence of God experience for me, but it was an enlightenment. I was present to the image for the first time, and in a way, it spoke to me, not with a voice, but my accurate perception of it made it seem like a message of confirmation. Yeah, that visit did go just fine. And in that moment, I accepted the blessing. A spiritual experience can be dramatic, or it can be smaller, subtler, like that. Marsha Linehan had been dealing with some pretty serious suffering, and her whole life had been an emotional roller coaster up to the moment she described in that convent chapel and for some time afterward. My experience came at a time of anxiety and stress in an otherwise ordinary life. Hers was dramatic and transformative, mine subtle, registering a small step of progress. And that range from dramatic to small, with the small being more the rule, is how Yaden and Newberg can describe spiritual experiences too common to dismiss. Now, by choosing the Varieties of Spiritual Experience as the title of their book, Yaden and Newberg meant to evoke and honor William James, who's known as the father of psychology in the United States. Writing 120 years after James, they aimed to bring his ideas forward, at least the ones they liked. And they emphasized that since James's Varieties of Religious Experience was published in 1902, a lot has changed in psychology and neurology, and there are now new ways of studying spiritual experiences scientifically, new methods of analyzing qualitative data, and new ways to design controlled experiments to study altered states of consciousness. Lack of method and legal prescriptions had stalled for many decades further development of James's scientific approach to the subject. James gave many examples of spiritual experiences, some clinical, some literary, including one reported by an English Unitarian minister's autobiography. The Reverend John Trevor's My Quest for God, published in 1897, described his journey through personal crises and doubts about his received Christian faith to a new understanding of faith that emphasized direct experience of the divine. He wrote about his childhood faith, his adult collapse of faith, and his recovery of faith through engaging in social reform. He came to understand religion as an experiential quest shaped by nature, travel, and labor struggles, rather than by received teachings. turning from institutional creeds to personal spiritual experiences and linking spiritual awakening to the emancipation of labor. He saw reform work as being fellow workers with God in a cosmic process. Trevor left the Unitarian ministry to found a new church in Manchester, England called the Labor Church. It didn't last. But a century later, in Arlington, Massachusetts, David Whitford found a church home where something like Trevor's understanding of religion had become part of the mainstream. A lot had changed, not only in science, but in Unitarianism. Yaden and Newberg are a bit selective about which of James's ideas they emphasize. For example, James thought that spiritual experiences were the source of religions, that religious traditions arose in response to them or to account for them. But treating such experiences as data to study and analyzing them using careful scientific methods, these authors set such speculations aside. They restrict themselves to interpreting the 461 responses to their survey, called the Varieties Survey, where they asked Americans to describe their spiritual experiences and answer questions about them. Now, they are still collecting descriptions of spiritual experiences at a website called the Varieties Corpus, C-O-R-P-U-S, Corpus, the Varieties Corpus. The website says people from all over the world have described these experiences throughout history up to and including today. Does that sound familiar? Data collected from this site will be used for scientific research or public education. And yes, you can submit a description of your spiritual experience at varietiescorpus.com, in case you'd like to do that. In their book, they do present William James's ideas reasonably fairly, as well as more recent psychological theories. I was interested in what they had to say about the research that neuroscientists have conducted, though it is still early days in that field, yielding more hints than conclusions. They report a little about studies going on at Johns Hopkins using psychedelics like psilocybin, which might produce a method for doing controlled experiments to study altered states of consciousness. That avenue was closed for a long time due to public attitudes and to laws governing controlled substances. They also described the methods they used to analyze the narrative data collected in their survey. And they described a technique called factor analysis, which I don't understand, but by which they derived from that narrative data some general categories of spiritual experiences. I feel I should say that doubts arose for me about the rigor of their scholarship when they described John Trevor, an Englishman who died in 1930, as a Unitarian Universalist, an affiliation specifically American and in any case not available in his lifetime. They also called David Whitford a Unitarian Universalist minister, which he is not. But setting that aside, they are employed at reputable medical research schools, Yaden at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Newberg at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and the University of Pennsylvania thinks enough of them to host their Varieties Corpus website. So with those errors noted, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. What I'd like to focus on this morning is their categorization of spiritual experiences. The insert on your order of service, you can go home later and find your magnifying glass and, review rather than follow along. I was overly ambitious, giving you some framing for this sermon. But that little table on your order of service summarizes their categories and also presents some of William James's key ideas from the Varieties of Religious Experience, his book, along with Unitarian theologian Henry Nelson Wyman's entertaining assessment of popular ideas of and responses to spiritual experiences. Like James and Wyman, Yaden and Newberg take narrative data, descriptions and interpretations of spiritual experiences given by people who have had them, and try to analyze them in a useful way. Like them, they understand spiritual experiences as individual and subjective. For his purposes, William James defined religion as the feelings, acts, and experiences of individuals in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. Nice, wide open framing. Observing that some people suffer more than others, either because of their circumstances or because of their sensitivity, he divided religious thought into two categories: healthy-minded and morbid-minded. Those less affected by suffering, the healthy-minded, focus on happiness, reasonableness, and optimism. Those more affected by suffering, the morbid-minded, focus on pain, relief from pain, and having more zest for life, finding a way to have more zest for life. Though he didn't expressly refer to it, James thought about religion in terms set by colonial New England's struggle with the conversion experience. The first Puritan colonists in Massachusetts, in a sort of scientific spirit, required evidence of salvation. For church membership, one had to be able to report having had a life-changing spiritual experience, and there had to be evidence of it in the way one lived. This system broke down quickly as elders refused to admit church members' children to membership because they couldn't give such testimony and evidence. Can you imagine how you would feel as a parent? Many Puritan churches made a compromise that became known as the halfway covenant. Children of church members were admitted to membership despite not meeting that test. And this was justified by broadening the definition of conversion. For some people, it was a dramatic experience. For others, a gradual process. What we speak of today as spiritual growth. And church membership became understood as something that supported that gradual process. James reinterpreted this understanding of spiritual experience in psychological terms of what we call spiritual growth. He said, character gradually attains unity. Character gradually attains unity. Concise, forward definition of spiritual growth. He wrote about the divided self, part of which we experience in our normal consciousness, and another part that he called extramarginal or ultramarginal. Evidence of this ultramarginal consciousness, he says, was discovered by science in 1886, so quite recently when he was writing. He drew an analogy to visual perception, noting that our vision consists of what we look at and also our peripheral vision, and then there are things we don't see because they're behind us, unavailable to our eyes. So the analogy is that this stuff is unavailable to our normal consciousness. And so regarding the dramatic spiritual experience the Puritans called a conversion experience, he wrote, The most important consequence of having a strongly developed ultra-marginal life is that one's ordinary fields of consciousness are liable to incursions from it, of which the subject does not guess the source, and which therefore take the form of unaccountable impulses to act or inhibitions of action, obsessive ideas, or even hallucinations of sight or hearing, uprushes into the ordinary consciousness of energies originating in the subliminal parts of the mind. This, of course, is what Freud called neuroses and complexes, but in the context of religious experiences, James allowed that these incursions might be upwellings of awareness that had been incubating subconsciously gradual spiritual growth. Or they might be more dramatic, if fleeting, infloodings of awareness that inspire self-surrender, conversion experience. How do you know if it's a religious experience? Good pragmatist that he was, James said, by its fruits. The consequences, if it was one. Right? That's his theory of pragmatism. What's true? Prove it by its results. And he discussed the response to a religious experience, an understanding or spiritual practice one adopts to incorporate it into one's normal consciousness in terms of saintliness, another good old Puritan notion. James discussed mystical experiences at length. He characterized them as temporary altered states of consciousness that break down our accustomed rational or rationalized ideas about ourselves or the world or both. They're beneficial, he thought, if they strengthen our optimism or our sense of belonging to a larger order. He described the shift from ordinary to mystical consciousness as from less to more, from smallness to vastness, from limited to unlimited, from unrest to a reconciling or unifying rest. The ineffable quality of such experiences that they're hard to describe in words, he called a no in service of a deeper yes. So that's James. Wyman's concern was with the best methods to respond to mystical experiences, to try to take fair account of the many kinds of experiences and responses that are called mystical. He decided to classify all the different meanings of mysticism that he could think of and consider them as all types of this experience. So he thought of 11 types and then categorized them amusingly under the rubrics worthless, better, and best. Wish he'd have been more clear about what he thought, but The best, he thought, either involved gaining an awareness of being part of something larger, an organic unity or an integrating process, or else something that an experience of resolving a problem, either a personal crisis or simply an unfulfilled desire to grow spiritually. There again is the conversion or the gradual spiritual growth idea. And in the spiritual experience that does that, it's a experience of discarding old ideas, or a practice of discarding old ideas and waiting open-mindedly for new understandings. Having an open attitude as a spiritual practice. That sounds to me like liberal religion. How about you? Now, Wyman was all about finding new framings for religious or spiritual ideas. I always say that instead of methods of private religious living, anyone else writing at that time would have titled his book Prayer. Or maybe somebody writing it today would just call it Spiritual Practice, Methods of Private Religious Living. The key to understanding Wyman's writings is to figure out what new words he has substituted for which traditional ones. His 11th very best type of mysticism, waiting open-mindedly for new understanding, recalls the many psalms with the refrain, "Wait by the Lord." Like James, he reframed spiritual practices as having psychological purposes. Now, to return to Yaden and Newberg's survey and the categories of spiritual experience that they derived from it, they pared it down to 6 categories: numinous, revelatory, mystical, aesthetic, synchronicity, and paranormal. More than a third of their survey responses described what they called a numinous experience, that is, one where the subject described the experience as in some way an experience of the presence of God. The next largest category, about a sixth of their survey respondents, they classed as revelatory, meaning they involved seeing a vision or hearing a voice or receiving an epiphany or a calling. Those 2 categories include a bit more than half of their surveys. Now, early on in the book, they discuss a philosophical debate between partisans, whom they label constructivists and perennialists. The debate is about the degree to which spiritual experiences are shaped in the first place by cultural influences. Constructivists, they say, argue that all experiences are completely conditioned by cultural influences, and people's psychological experiences are made distinct according to their cultural context. It is not that there are merely different words for common experiences, but these different cultures make people's actual subjective experience of these things different. The perennialists, on the other hand, hold that experiences are largely similar across cultures, and that spiritual experiences are a human universal, essentially the same across time and place. And that's a view that James, in some places, seemed to endorse. In the end, Yaden and Newberg decide that they fall somewhere in the middle. They don't say exactly where, but they're not either of those extremes. Now, of the 6 categories that they discerned, those 2, numinous and revelatory, are types of experience depicted in the Bible. To me, it seems like if more than half of the spiritual experiences described in a sample of Americans are described in biblical terms, at least the vocabulary, if not the entire interpretation by the person reporting the experience, is culturally influenced. As Americans, we don't have to be Christian or Jewish to be influenced by biblical ideas or vocabulary. We swim in it. You could pick it up from movies or TV. So it's not clear to me that these categories are really distinct from each other or from their 3rd largest category of experiences, about an 1/8 of the surveys, which they labeled mystical and describe as involving a sense of deep connection and often a sense of loss or diminishment of a separate sense of self. As Marcia Linehan put it, God was within me, I was within God. That kind of idea. A distinct category for reports couched in biblically influenced vocabulary, then, might be a distinction without a difference. It might be that 5/8 of their data describe essentially the same kind of experience. An encounter with something larger and other, variously described in terms Yaden and Newberg differentiate as numerous, revelatory, or mystical, due to the degree of cultural influence on the subject's account of it. In other words, they might have applied factor analysis in a way that misled them. Now, I said before, I don't understand factor analysis, but it seems to me if you don't design the survey to exclude or even out or some way identify cultural influence, you might be making distinctions that really aren't there if you had a long talk with two people who describe their experiences differently. Or possibly there's some way of controlling for that with factor analysis that I don't know about. It sounded to me like they just took the terms in their narrative data as they were, allowing the cultural influences to shape their categories. And the next largest category, about a 1/12 of the surveys, they class as aesthetic, involving a sense of awe arising from observing nature or an artistic performance. Many more than a 1/12 of the population, I think, must have had an experience like that. That so few report them as examples of a spiritual experience probably might reflect our tendency to think of spiritual experiences as dramatic rather than small, supernatural rather than natural. The 5th largest category, at 1/20 or 5% of the surveys, were experiences of synchronicity or meaningful coincidences that might give one the feeling of peering into the deeper meaning of events. These might be grouped with aesthetic experiences rather than classed separately if they felt analogous to a sense of awe at a natural process. Or they could be classed with numinous or revelatory or mystical experiences if they felt possibly supernatural. The last category is paranormal experiences, and it includes a 1/5 of the survey responses, but a rather motley array of examples. Seeing a ghost or an angel or another such entity, but also various forms of extrasensory perception, like telepathy, precognition, and something called retrocognition, which they define as extrasensory knowledge about the past. To me, that could be a definition of history. After all, most historians have no direct sensory experience of their subject. However that may be, their paranormal category does seem more like a catch-all to me than a category, which would account for it encompassing 20% of their data and making it their 2nd largest category. So as you see, I came away feeling doubtful about their results, and I wonder if what's at the bottom of that feeling isn't their reliance on William James. James himself characterized his varieties of religious experience as a tentative exploration of the subject. He considered himself an outsider to such experience, claiming not to have had one himself. And as I have noted, his ideas about them follow the pattern found in his New England cultural heritage. Most accounts of the kind of experience they're trying to study describe moments of personal meaning, often with an aspect of personal or spiritual growth. One might expect them, therefore, to draw upon insights from theories underlying psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, but of these, they write, in general, while psychoanalysis provides a number of speculative perspectives on spiritual experience, in our view, James provided a more balanced and evidence-based account of spiritual experiences than either Freud's pathologizing perspective or Jung's almost wholly enthusiastic assessment. Nevertheless, Yaden and Newberg go out of their way to mention that the editor of Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, left out a chapter Jung had written about how James's ideas had influenced him. Harvard's Countway Library holds the unpublished material from which Yaden and Newberg quote, "I was most stimulated," Jung wrote, "by James's ideas about religious psychology, his effort to give some objective picture of what is felt to be a religious experience, served to some extent as a model for me. I was profoundly stirred by his presentation of the religious experience as a direct occurrence, a fact whose nature is what it is, In other words, he did not attempt to fit any such experience into a theoretical formula. He approached these phenomena with an unbiased, pragmatic attitude, and thus showed me a path which subsequently led me to gratifying results. Now, those gratifying results, I imagine, rested on Jung's reliance on his patient sense of the meaning of their experience rather than imposing a version of a Greek myth on it, as Freud did. Jung followed James in his pragmatism. A spiritual experience is what it is. And his patient sense of its meaning was a clue to the message the patient's unconscious mind was trying to communicate into consciousness. Recall that James saw spiritual experiences as incursions from outside normal consciousness, upwellings of awareness that had been incubating subconsciously, or sudden infloodings of awareness seemingly from nowhere. What's missing in James that Jung supplied is a theory of why this happens. Like Wyman, Jung saw the best outcome of a spiritual experience as one that involved gaining an awareness of being part of something larger, an organic unity, an integrating process, or else one that resolved a problem, either a personal crisis or simply an unfulfilled desire to grow by discarding old ideas for new understandings. I don't think one can understand spiritual experiences outside a framework of human development. And I do think that Yaden and Duberg would reach more persuasive conclusions from their data if they worked out how to incorporate what we know about human development and life stages and lifespan learning into their survey design. That's up to them to figure out how to do that, but I think they need to do that. Also, I think they need to find a way to control for cultural influences, rather than just taking them as they are, as James did. Meanwhile, the future is calling, it's calling for healing. Do you hear it? Can you hear it? The future is calling, it's calling for healing, and the people will sing along, and the singing will make us strong. So may it be. Amen.
I invite you to remain standing. Sandy, would you come back and extinguish our chalice? And we're going to join together in saying our closing words. Go out into the world in peace. Have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the suffering. And honor all beings.
And may your singing keep you strong.